In the year 1243, in a prosperous cloth-making town in the heart of England, a weaver named Alden worked at his loom with the same unhurried rhythm that had defined his craft for decades. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a medieval weaving workshop where we will follow Alden through the peaceful tasks of his daily work. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Alden, 41 years old, sat at his broad wooden loom as morning light filtered through the open shutters of his workshop. His calloused fingers moved across the threads with practiced ease, and the graying beard that framed his weathered face caught the golden glow of early sun. The loom before him held a length of wool cloth in progress, the threads stretched taut and waiting for his attention. The scent of lanolin rose from the wool, mingling with the earthy smell of the wooden beams overhead. Each thread passed through his hands carried the faint aroma of the sheep that had given their fleece months before, a scent so familiar it had become part of the workshop itself. The morning air held a coolness that would fade by midday, and Alden appreciated the comfort of this gentle temperature as he worked. His hands knew the rhythm without conscious thought. The shuttle passed through the shed, carrying the weft thread across the warp in one smooth motion. The beater came forward with a satisfying thump, pressing the new thread into place against those that had come before. Back went the shuttle, forward came the beater, and the cloth grew by tiny increments with each pass. Sunlight moved across the floor in slow progression, marking time more reliably than any bells. The beam of light had started at the eastern wall when Alden first sat down, and now it crept toward the center of the room, illuminating particles of wool fiber that drifted lazily through the air. The motes caught the light and seemed to hang suspended, tiny stars in the quiet space of the workshop. The wooden frame of the loom was old, its surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Alden's father had worked at this same loom, and his grandfather before him. The tool had been built to last generations, crafted from oak that had been seasoned for years before the frame was assembled. Each beam and post fit together with mortise and tenon joints, held secure by wooden pegs that had never loosened in all the years of the loom's service. Alden hummed a plainchant melody while working, a habit formed during his years as a boy in the church choir. The tune rose and fell in gentle waves, matching the rhythm of his hands as they guided the shuttle back and forth. The melody required no thought, emerging naturally as breath and movement aligned in the familiar pattern of his craft. The wool he wove today came from local sheep, their fleece shorn in spring and prepared through summer. The thread had been spun by women in the town, their fingers twisting the fibers into long, even strands that now stretched across his loom. Some threads were dyed a soft brown using walnut husks, while others remained the natural cream color of the wool itself. The pattern he created was simple, alternating stripes that would make sturdy cloth for a merchant's household. By mid-morning, the workshop had warmed. The coolness of dawn gave way to comfortable mildness, and Alden's movements remained steady and unhurried. His shoulders held no tension, his breathing stayed even and deep. The repetitive motion of the weaving created a meditation of sorts, his mind resting in the present moment while his hands continued their ancient work. The shuttle was made of boxwood, dense and smooth, fitting perfectly in his palm. Its pointed ends allowed it to slip through the shed with minimal resistance, and its hollow center held the bobbin of weft thread. Alden had carved this shuttle himself years ago, shaping it during the long winter evenings when darkness came early and there was time for such careful work. His apprentice, a boy of 14 named Osric, arrived mid-morning carrying a basket of newly spun thread. The lad moved quietly, setting the basket near the door before approaching the loom to observe his master's work. Osric had been with Alden for 2 years now, learning the craft with the same patience his master displayed in teaching it. Alden paused in his weaving, his hands coming to rest on the beater. He turned to regard his apprentice with mild interest, noting the careful way the boy had set down the basket to avoid disturbing the workspace. This attentiveness was one of Osric's finest qualities, paired with genuine eagerness to learn and a steady temperament that suited the long hours at the loom. The master gestured toward a smaller loom that stood against the western wall. Osric had been practicing on that frame for months, creating simple cloth under Alden's watchful eye. The boy moved to his station without need for spoken instruction, settling onto his bench and beginning the same rhythmic work his master performed, though with less refined movements and slower pace. The workshop filled with the sound of 2 looms working in gentle harmony. The larger loom's deeper thump provided a steady foundation, while the smaller loom's lighter beat created a counterpoint. The 2 weavers worked in companionable silence, each focused on the threads before them, the morning progressing with the measured grace of clouds drifting across an autumn sky. Alden's gaze drifted occasionally to the window, where he could see the narrow street beyond. Other craftsmen worked in their shops along this lane, each pursuing their trade with similar dedication. A potter shaped clay at his wheel 3 doors down, and across the way, a carpenter planed boards for a merchant's chest. The sounds of their work blended with the street noise, creating the familiar soundscape of a prosperous town. The loom's warp threads were made of stronger yarn than the weft, designed to withstand the tension of being stretched across the frame. Alden had helped set up this warp himself several weeks ago, a task that required precision and patience. Each thread needed to be the same length and under the same tension, or the finished cloth would be uneven and flawed. He and Osric had spent an entire morning on the task, working together to ensure every detail was correct. The weaving proceeded in its timeless rhythm. Pass the shuttle through, beat the weft into place, change the shed by pressing the foot treadles, pass the shuttle back. The pattern repeated thousands of times, each repetition adding another fraction of an inch to the growing cloth. There was something deeply satisfying in watching the fabric emerge gradually, the result of countless small actions accumulating into something useful and beautiful. Midday approached, and the light through the window shifted to a warmer tone. The scent of bread baking somewhere nearby drifted into the workshop, reminding Alden that his wife would soon bring their noon meal. She always prepared something simple, usually bread and cheese with ale, sometimes accompanied by an apple or a handful of nuts. The food would give him energy to continue through the afternoon, though he never felt depleted by his work. His calloused fingers moved across a knot in the weft thread, finding the irregularity through touch alone. He paused to examine it, then carefully worked the knot free before continuing. Such small imperfections were common in hand-spun thread, and addressing them promptly prevented larger problems later. The correction took only moments, and soon his hands resumed their steady rhythm. Alden, 41 years old, felt the deep contentment that always accompanied his work. This emotional baseline defined his days, a quiet satisfaction that came from mastering a craft over decades and seeing the tangible results of his labor. The cloth growing on his loom would become clothing, perhaps a tunic for a craftsman or a cloak for a merchant. It would provide warmth and service for years, a lasting contribution that gave purpose to each movement of his hands. The workshop walls were thick stone on the ground floor, providing coolness in summer and holding warmth in winter. Above, wooden beams supported the floor of the family's living quarters, and Alden could sometimes hear his wife moving about overhead, tending to household tasks with the same methodical care he brought to his weaving. Their life together followed predictable patterns, each day similar to the one before, and this constancy brought comfort rather than monotony. Osric worked steadily at his smaller loom, his brow furrowed in concentration. The boy was creating a simple cloth of undyed wool, working to achieve even tension and straight edges. Alden glanced over occasionally, nodding the progress with approval. The lad's work had improved considerably over recent months, his hands gaining the muscle memory that came only through repetition. The afternoon stretched ahead with more weaving to fill the hours. Alden would work until the light began to fade, then set aside his tools and join his family for the evening meal. After eating, he might spend time checking his supplies or preparing materials for the next day's work. Eventually, he would climb the stairs to the sleeping quarters, lie down on the straw-filled mattress, and rest until dawn called him back to the loom. But such thoughts of future hours held no urgency. The present moment contained everything necessary: the feel of smooth wood beneath his hands, the steady thump of the beater, the slow growth of cloth on the loom before him. Time moved at its own pace, neither hurried nor delayed, and Alden moved with it in perfect harmony. The shuttle passed through the shed once more, carrying its burden of thread from selvage to selvage. The beater came forward, pressing everything into place. The cloth grew by another thread's width, and the afternoon continued its gentle progression toward evening. The bells for sext rang across the town, their sound rolling through the streets and reaching Alden's workshop through the open shutters. He paused in his work, listening to the familiar tones that marked the middle of the day. The bells came from the church of St. Edmund, whose stone tower rose above the rooftops 3 streets away. Their sound had marked the hours of his life since childhood, a constant presence as reliable as the sunrise. His wife appeared in the doorway moments later, carrying a wooden tray with their midday meal. Margaret, 37 years old, with work-worn hands and brown hair streaked with gray, moved into the workshop with the quiet efficiency that characterized all her actions. She set the tray on a small table near the window, where sunlight illuminated the simple food she had prepared. Alden rose from his bench, his body stiff from hours of sitting in one position. He stretched carefully, feeling his muscles respond to the movement, then crossed to where Margaret waited. Osric also left his loom, approaching the table with respectful silence. The three of them stood together for a moment of quiet gratitude before beginning their meal. The bread was fresh from that morning's baking, its crust golden and firm beneath Alden's fingers. He tore a piece free and found the interior soft and yielding, still holding a trace of warmth from the oven. The taste was simple and satisfying, the grain's natural flavor enhanced by the slight tang of the sourdough starter Margaret maintained in a crock by the hearth. Cheese accompanied the bread, a firm yellow cheese aged through summer in the cool cellar beneath their home. Its flavor was mild and nutty, complementing the bread perfectly. Margaret had cut it into thick slices, and Alden appreciated the care she took in such small preparations. The ale she poured was cool and smooth, brewed by a neighbor who had perfected his craft over many years. They ate without much conversation, the companionable silence more comfortable than words. Osric finished quickly, being young and always hungry, then excused himself to step outside for a few moments of fresh air. Margaret gathered the wooden cups and plates, preparing to carry them back upstairs, but she paused to examine the cloth growing on Alden's loom. Her fingers traced the edge of the fabric, feeling its texture and checking the evenness of the weave. Margaret had grown up in a weaving household herself, and though she no longer worked at the loom, she retained her understanding of the craft. She nodded approvingly at what she found, then turned to her husband with a slight smile that expressed satisfaction without need for words. After Margaret departed, Alden returned to his bench. The food had renewed his energy without making him heavy or drowsy. His hands found their familiar positions on the loom, and the shuttle resumed its passage through the warp threads. The afternoon had brought fuller warmth now, and the air in the workshop felt pleasant against his skin. Osric returned and settled back at his smaller loom. The boy had grown taller over the past year, Alden noticed, his frame filling out with the good food and steady work. In a few more years, Osric would be ready to establish his own workshop, perhaps taking a wife and beginning the cycle anew. But such future developments lay far ahead, and for now, the apprentice remained focused on mastering the fundamentals of his trade. The pattern Alden wove required changing the weft color every few inches, creating stripes of brown and cream that would make the finished cloth more interesting to the eye. When the bobbin of brown thread ran low, he paused to wind a fresh bobbin, using a simple spindle to transfer thread from a larger skein. His hands performed this task automatically, the movements so familiar they required no conscious attention. Outside the window, clouds had begun to gather in the western sky. They were high and thin, the kind that often appeared on autumn afternoons without bringing rain. Their presence softened the sunlight slightly, diffusing it into a gentler illumination that reduced harsh shadows in the workshop. Alden appreciated this change, finding the softer light easier on his eyes during the long hours of close work. The wooden beater in his hands had been shaped by his grandfather, carved from a single piece of ash and polished smooth through decades of use. The tool fit Alden's grip perfectly, its weight balanced so that bringing it forward required minimal effort. He could feel the grain of the wood beneath his fingers, each annual ring a record of the tree's growth long before it was felled and fashioned into this essential tool. Alden hummed his plain chant melody while working, the same tune that had accompanied his weaving since morning. The melody wove itself through his actions like an invisible thread, connecting each movement to the next in an unbroken flow. His breathing aligned with the rhythm, deep and regular, his chest rising and falling in time with the passage of the shuttle. The afternoon progressed in measured increments. The cloth on the loom grew longer, inch by careful inch. The light through the window shifted gradually across the floor, tracking the sun's slow arc across the sky. The sounds from the street outside continued their familiar patterns, footsteps passing, voices calling greetings, the occasional creak of a cart's wooden wheels over cobblestones. A cat wandered into the workshop through the open door, a gray tabby that lived in the neighborhood and visited various shops throughout the day. The animal approached Alden's loom and sat nearby, watching the shuttle's movement with mild feline interest. After a few moments, the cat curled up on a patch of sunlight on the floor, tucking its paws beneath its body and closing its eyes in contentment. Alden noted the cat's presence with quiet amusement, one of his 3 core personality traits showing through the gentle upturn at the corner of his mouth. He had always appreciated the companionship of animals, finding their presence soothing and their simple needs refreshing after the complexities of human interaction. The cat's purring added another layer to the workshop's soundscape, a soft rumble that blended with the thump of the looms. The wool threads passing through his fingers carried subtle variations in texture, some slightly thicker than others, some with longer fibers that created a softer hand. These small differences were natural characteristics of hand-spun thread, and Alden's experienced touch could detect them instantly. He adjusted his tension slightly to accommodate each variation, ensuring the finished cloth would be as even as possible despite the natural irregularities of the materials. By mid-afternoon, Alden paused to examine his progress. He had added perhaps 6 inches to the cloth since morning, a respectable amount given the care he took with each thread. The stripes were straight and even, the selvages clean and firm. When this piece was finished and taken from the loom, it would be ready for fulling, the process that would shrink and tighten the weave through moisture and pressure, creating cloth that was warm and weather-resistant. He stood and walked to a shelf where he kept various supplies. His movements were unhurried, his 41-year-old body still strong and capable despite decades of repetitive work. He selected a new skein of brown wool, checking its quality by touch before carrying it back to his workspace. The yarn had been spun evenly, twisted tightly enough to be strong without being so tight it became stiff and difficult to work with. Osric had completed several inches of his practice cloth, and Alden moved to examine the apprentice's work. The boy looked up anxiously as his master approached, but Alden's observant eye found much to praise. The edges were straighter than last week, the tension more consistent. He placed a hand on Osric's shoulder briefly, a gesture of approval that brought visible relief to the young face. The master returned to his own loom and settled back onto his bench. The wooden seat had been smoothed by years of use, fitting the shape of his body perfectly. He arranged himself comfortably, his feet finding their positions on the treadles, his hands reaching for the shuttle. The afternoon's work resumed with the same steady rhythm that had carried him through the morning. The scent of wool continued to dominate the workshop's atmosphere, but underneath it, Alden could detect other familiar smells. There was the faint aroma of linseed oil, used occasionally to treat the wood of the loom and keep it supple. The stone walls held the earthy smell of old mortar and lime. From somewhere outside came the sweet scent of someone's herb garden, perhaps basil or thyme catching the afternoon sun. Time seemed to slow as he worked, each moment stretching and expanding to contain the fullness of sensory experience. The warmth of the air against his skin, the smooth passage of thread through his fingers, the satisfying resistance of the beater as it pressed each new thread into place. All of these sensations filled his awareness completely, leaving no room for worry or distraction. The cat on the floor had fallen into deep sleep, its breathing slow and regular. Alden glanced at the creature occasionally, finding something peaceful in its complete relaxation. Animals knew how to rest properly, surrendering fully to sleep when it was time, working purposefully when action was needed. There was wisdom in such simplicity that humans often forgot in their tendency to complicate matters. His calloused fingers found a small slub in the weft thread, a place where the yarn had been spun unevenly, creating a thicker section. He worked it carefully through the shed, adjusting his tension to prevent it from pulling the cloth askew. Such small corrections were constant in hand weaving, requiring attention without demanding stress. The imperfections were part of the craft's nature, and cloth woven by hand possessed a character that could never be replicated by any imagined future method. The shuttle passed through the shed again, trailing its thread like a boat leaving a wake across still water. Back and forth, the motion as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the tide. Alden's mind rested in this rhythm, his thoughts quiet and still, his 41 years of experience allowing him to work without the strain of conscious effort. Shadows had begun to lengthen in the workshop, though full afternoon still held sway. The light had taken on a golden quality, richer and warmer than the pale illumination of morning. This was Alden's favorite time of the working day, when everything seemed to glow with gentle radiance, and the hours ahead promised nothing more demanding than continued steady effort. His work-reddened hands moved across the loom with unhurried grace, and the cloth continued to grow beneath his care. The day unfolded as days should, each moment sufficient unto itself, requiring nothing beyond presence and attention. The shuttle passed through, the beater came forward, and the ancient craft of weaving continued as it had for countless generations before him. The afternoon wore on in its peaceful rhythm, and Alden found himself thinking of the sheep whose wool he wove. They grazed on hillsides beyond the town walls, their days spent in simple contentment much like his own hours at the loom. The connection between shepherd and weaver, between field and workshop, formed an unbroken chain that stretched back through centuries of human craft and care. A gentle breeze stirred through the open shutters, carrying with it the scent of ripening apples from an orchard somewhere nearby. The air moved across Alden's face and arms, cooling the warmth that had built up through the afternoon's work. He paused for a moment to appreciate this small blessing, tilting his head slightly to feel the current more fully against his skin. The cat on the floor stirred and stretched, extending its front legs and arching its back before settling into a new position. The creature's movements were fluid and unhurried, a reminder that rest and activity could flow into each other without tension or resistance. Alden watched this brief display with the mild amusement that formed part of his steady temperament, then returned his attention to the threads before him. Osric had stopped his work to wind a fresh bobbin, and the workshop filled with only the sound of Alden's loom for a few moments. The rhythmic thumping seemed louder in the absence of its companion, each beat marking time with satisfying regularity. The master weaver appreciated these variations in the day's soundscape, finding beauty in both the harmony of two looms working together and the solitary voice of his own. The brown stripe he was currently weaving had grown to the width of his hand, and soon it would be time to switch back to the cream-colored wool. He observed the growing pattern with quiet satisfaction, noting how the stripes created visual interest without complexity. The cloth would serve its purpose well, providing warmth and durability to whoever eventually wore garments made from it. Margaret appeared briefly at the top of the stairs visible through the workshop's rear door, carrying a basket of mending. She settled herself on a bench in the small courtyard beyond, where afternoon light still lingered. Alden could hear the faint sound of her needle working through fabric, a softer counterpoint to the loom's deeper voice. Their separate labors proceeded in companionable proximity, each absorbed in familiar tasks that required no discussion. The warp thread stretched before him like the strings of some enormous instrument, each one tuned to the same tension, each one contributing its voice to the whole. Alden's fingers plucked them occasionally as he worked, checking their tightness, ensuring none had loosened or broken. The sound they made was barely audible, a soft note that spoke of proper preparation and careful maintenance. His thoughts drifted to the origin of his craft, to ancient peoples who had first discovered that threads could be interlaced to create fabric. He imagined early weavers working with primitive looms, discovering through patient experimentation the techniques that had been refined over generations into the methods he practiced today. The continuity of this knowledge pleased him, the sense of participating in something far larger and older than his individual life. The shuttle in his hand was warm from constant handling, the boxwood smooth as water-worn stone. He had carved it to fit his grip precisely, shaping the curves and angles through careful attention to how his fingers naturally wanted to hold the tool. This customization made the work easier, reducing the small frictions that could accumulate over hours into fatigue or discomfort. Afternoon light filtered through the thin clouds outside, creating a diffuse glow that softened every surface in the workshop. The stone walls seemed to absorb this light and hold it, radiating a gentle warmth back into the space. Even the dust motes floating through the air appeared luminous, tiny sparks drifting on invisible currents. Alden hummed his plain chant melody while working, the familiar tune emerging as naturally as breath. The melody had no particular meaning or purpose. It was simply a companion to his labor, a way of marking rhythm and maintaining the meditative state that made long hours at the loom feel shorter than they actually were. His voice was quiet and untrained, but the notes were pure and true, rising and falling in patterns learned decades ago. The brown weft thread came to an end, and Alden tied on the cream-colored yarn with a weaver's knot, pulling it tight and trimming the excess clothes to avoid any lumps in the finished fabric. His fingers performed this task with automatic precision, the movements so deeply ingrained they required no thought. He tested the join by tugging gently, confirming its strength before continuing his work. The shuttle resumed its passage, now trailing cream instead of brown. The color change created a clean line across the cloth, marking the transition from one stripe to the next. Alden appreciated the visual clarity of this pattern, the way it demonstrated the basic principles of weaving in a form anyone could understand. Warp and weft, over and under, the simplest possible interlacing creating something far stronger than any single thread. Osric returned to his own loom, and the two workers fell back into their synchronized rhythm. The apprentice's technique had improved noticeably over recent weeks, his movements becoming more fluid and confident. Alden noted this progress with the quiet pride of a teacher seeing a student grasp not just the mechanics but the essence of a craft. In time, Osric would develop his own style, his own slight variations on the traditional methods, contributing his individual voice to the ongoing conversation of the weaving trade. The breeze through the window carried new scents now, wood smoke from someone lighting an early cooking fire, the earthy smell of dampened dust from a street newly swept. These aromas layered over the constant presence of wool and lanolin, creating a complex tapestry of smell that was as much a part of the afternoon as the visual or auditory elements surrounding him. Alden's gaze drifted occasionally to his hands, watching them move through their practiced motions. These work-reddened hands had served him faithfully for 41 years, growing stronger and more skilled with each passing season. The calluses that marked his fingers and palms were badges of his profession, signs of countless hours spent in productive labor. He felt gratitude for their continued strength and dexterity, knowing that his livelihood depended on their reliable service. The loom itself seemed almost alive under his care, responding to his touch like a well-trained horse responding to subtle commands from its rider. He knew every part of this tool intimately, which treadle required a firmer push, where the warp beam tended to stick slightly, how much tension the threads could bear before risking breakage. This knowledge had accumulated gradually through years of daily interaction, building a relationship between craftsman and instrument that went beyond mere familiarity into something approaching partnership. The cream stripe grew steadily, thread by thread, as the afternoon progressed toward evening. Soon the bells would ring for vespers, marking the traditional end of the working day. But Alden would continue for another hour or more after that, using the last good light to add more length to his cloth. The day's rhythm was his own to set, governed by the needs of his work and the capacity of his hands rather than any external schedule. A neighbor passed the window, calling a greeting that Alden returned with a nod and a few words. The man was a cordwainer, a maker of fine leather shoes, whose shop stood 2 buildings down the lane. They had known each other since childhood, growing up in this same quarter of the town and learning their respective trades from their fathers. Such long acquaintance required little in the way of conversation. A gesture, a brief exchange, was sufficient to maintain the bonds of neighborly regard. The cat had awakened and departed on some feline errand, leaving behind only the warm spot where it had slept, and a few gray hairs caught in the rough texture of the wooden floor. Alden smiled slightly at this evidence of the visit, another small instance of the gentle humor that was part of his nature. The workshop would see many such visitors over the years: cats, dogs, children peering curiously at the loom, customers coming to discuss commissions. Each left their small mark, their brief presence becoming part of the workshop's story. His 41 years stretched behind him like the warp threads on his loom, each one part of the larger pattern of his life. He could remember learning this craft as a boy younger than Osric, sitting beside his father at this same loom, his small hands struggling to manage the shuttle's weight and the beater's resistance. The memory held no sadness, only the warm recognition of continuity, of knowledge passed from generation to generation like a carefully tended flame. The shuttle passed through the shed once more, and the beater came forward with its satisfying thump. The cloth grew by another thread's width, and the ancient craft continued its timeless pattern. Outside, shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance, a bell began to toll the hour of vespers. The vespers bells faded into silence, their last notes drifting away across the rooftops like birds returning to roost. Alden continued his work without pause, the ringing having marked the hour but not demanded any change in his activity. The light remained adequate for weaving, and his hands showed no sign of the weariness that would eventually signal the day's end. Margaret came down from the courtyard, pausing at the workshop door to observe her husband and his apprentice at their labor. She said nothing, simply standing in the doorway for a moment before moving on toward the market square. Alden knew she went to purchase vegetables for the evening meal, perhaps some leeks or cabbage, maybe turnips if they looked fresh. Her errands followed their own reliable pattern, as predictable and comforting as his weaving. The cream-colored stripe had reached its intended width, and Alden prepared to switch back to brown. He reached for the bobbin of darker thread, checking its remaining length to ensure it held enough for the next section. His observant nature extended to such small details, preventing interruptions that might break the flow of his work. Everything he might need sat within arm's reach, arranged with the careful logic of long experience. Osric spoke for the first time in hours, asking a question about maintaining even selvages. His voice was respectful and genuinely curious, the tone of someone who truly wished to understand rather than merely going through the motions of apprenticeship. Alden answered patiently, explaining how the shuttle's angle as it entered and exited the shed affected the edge threads, demonstrating the correct approach with his own movements. The boy watched intently, his young face focused and serious. Alden remembered that same intensity in himself at that age, the burning desire to master every aspect of the craft. Time and practice would provide what enthusiasm alone could not: the deep muscle memory and intuitive understanding that allowed the work to flow without constant conscious attention. But eagerness was a good beginning, and Osric possessed it in abundance. After his brief instruction, Alden returned to his own cloth. The brown thread passed through his fingers, and the shuttle resumed its journey across the warp. The transition from cream to brown created another clean line, the stripes building into a pattern that was both simple and pleasing. He He could envision the finished cloth, perhaps 12 or 15 ells in length, rolled and ready for sale to the cloth merchants who would visit his workshop in a few weeks' time. The workshop had cooled slightly as the afternoon aged toward evening. The temperature remained comfortable, neither too warm nor carrying any chill, but Alden noticed the subtle shift nonetheless. His body had become attuned over the years to these small changes, reading the passage of time through sensation as much as through the movement of light and shadow. A dog barked somewhere down the lane, and another answered from a greater distance. The sounds carried clearly through the open shutters, part of the town's constant background conversation. Alden had lived with these sounds all his life: the barking of dogs, the crowing of roosters, the calls of merchants and craftsmen, the rumble of cart wheels over stone. They formed a familiar music that required no attention, yet would be missed immediately if absent. His calloused fingers encountered a small irregularity in one of the warp threads, a place where the spinning had created a thicker section. He worked around it carefully, adjusting the weft's path slightly to accommodate the variation without allowing it to distort the cloth's surface. Such tiny corrections happened dozens of times throughout the day, each one barely noticeable but collectively ensuring the fabric's quality and consistency. The shuttle moved through its arc with hypnotic regularity, its passage marking time as reliably as any sundial. Back and forth, each trip adding another thin line to the growing textile. The repetition held no monotony for Alden. Instead, it created a space of calm where his mind could rest while his hands continued their skilled labor. He thought of other weavers working at this same moment throughout the town and beyond, in villages and cities across the realm. Thousands of looms would be clicking and thumping, thousands of shuttles passing through their sheds, all contributing to the vast production of cloth that kept people warm and protected from the elements. The scale of this collective effort pleased him, the sense of being part of a great, distributed enterprise that spanned the known world. The brown stripe proceeded steadily toward its intended width. Alden's eyes tracked the growing pattern, ensuring the spacing remained consistent with the previous stripes. The cloth possessed its own logic, its own internal rules, and honoring them was part of the weaver's responsibility. A stripe too wide or too narrow would disrupt the visual rhythm, creating dissonance where there should be harmony. Margaret returned from the market, her basket laden with provisions for the evening meal. She climbed the stairs to their living quarters overhead, and soon Alden could smell the first hints of cooking, the sharp scent of onions being sliced, the earthy aroma of root vegetables being washed. His stomach responded with gentle hunger, not urgent but present, a reminder that the body required fuel as surely as the loom required thread. But there was time yet before the meal would be ready, time for more weaving, more adding to the cloth that grew beneath his hands. Alden settled deeper into his rhythm, his breathing aligning with the movement of the shuttle, his humming rising softly in the workshop's quiet space. The plain chant melody wove through the air like an invisible thread, connecting this moment to all the moments that had come before. Osric had found his own rhythm at the smaller loom, his movements less assured than his master's but growing steadier with each passing day. The boy would make a fine weaver, Alden thought. He possessed the necessary patience, and the willingness to attend to small details. These qualities mattered more than raw talent or quick learning. Weaving rewarded persistence and care, punishing haste and carelessness with flawed cloth that had to be laboriously corrected, or, in the worst cases, abandoned entirely. The light through the window had taken on the rich golden quality of late afternoon moving toward evening. Everything in the workshop seemed touched with amber, the stone walls glowing warmly, the wooden beams overhead holding the light like honey. This was the most beautiful hour of the day, when the world seemed to pause between the activity of afternoon and the rest of evening, holding its breath in the balance. Alden's work-reddened hands moved through their familiar dance, and the shuttle traced its path through the threads. The beater came forward with its satisfying sound, and another line was added to the pattern. Time flowed like water, smooth and continuous, carrying him gently forward through the hours. The brown stripe reached completion, and he began another section of cream. The alternation continued, building the pattern stripe by stripe, the cloth growing longer with patient incrementality. There was no need to rush, no pressure to complete the piece within any particular time frame. The work would take as long as it took, and the result would be sound cloth that served its purpose well. A swallow darted past the window, its flight swift and sure as it pursued insects in the evening air. Alden caught the movement from the corner of his eye, a flash of dark wings against the lighter sky. The birds would be gathering soon on the church tower, settling in for the night in the niches and ledges where they made their nests. Their evening chorus would rise as darkness fell, a familiar sound that marked the transition from day to night. His 41 years had taught him to appreciate such moments, to find richness in the simple observation of the world's patterns. The swallow's flight, the gathering of birds, the progression of light through the day, these things held beauty that required no embellishment or interpretation. They simply were, existing in their own perfect completeness, asking nothing but to be noticed. The shuttle passed through the shed again, and Alden's hands continued their ancient work. The loom stood solid and unchanging, the thread stretched taut and waiting, and the cloth grew steadily beneath his patient care. Evening approached with gentle inevitability, and the day moved toward its peaceful conclusion. The scent of cooking had grown stronger, drifting down from the living quarters above in warm, savory waves. Margaret was preparing a pottage. Alden could tell. The smell of simmering vegetables and barley filled the air with promise of the evening meal to come. His stomach responded with quiet anticipation, though hunger remained a gentle presence rather than an urgent demand. He finished the cream stripe and paused to roll the completed cloth forward on the loom, bringing fresh warp threads into working position. This task required standing and moving to the back of the loom, where he carefully released the tension and turned the great beam that held the finished fabric. The cloth wrapped around the beam with satisfying smoothness, each layer lying flat against the previous one. Osric watched this process with interest, knowing he would need to perform the same task on his own loom before long. Alden worked methodically, ensuring the tension remained even across all the warp threads as he adjusted the beam. Too much tension and threads might break, too little, and the weaving would become loose and uneven. The balance was delicate but familiar, something his hands understood through years of repetition. With fresh warp positioned for weaving, Alden returned to his bench and began the next brown stripe. The shuttle felt comfortable in his palm, its weight and balance perfectly suited to his grip. He had made several shuttles over the years, each one slightly different, learning through trial and experience what dimensions and proportions worked best for his particular style of weaving. The late afternoon light had begun its slow fade toward dusk, though full darkness remained more than an hour away. This transitional time held a particular quality that Alden had always appreciated, a softness in the air, a gentleness in the way shadows gathered and light withdrew. The world seemed to exhale, releasing the day's tension and preparing for night's restoration. A neighbor's child ran past the window, laughing at some game or chase. The sound of young voices carried clearly in the evening air, bright and uncomplicated. Alden listened with the mild pleasure of someone who had raised children of his own, now grown and pursuing their own lives in other parts of the town. The workshop would pass to his son eventually, continuing the family tradition into another generation. But such thoughts of future succession held no urgency. The present moment contained everything necessary: the feel of thread sliding through his fingers, the rhythmic sound of the beater, the comfortable warmth of the workshop as evening approached. His deep contentment, that emotional baseline that defined his character, suffused every aspect of the experience. Margaret called down that the meal would be ready soon, her voice carrying through the stairwell that connected workshop to living quarters. Alden acknowledged her with a brief response, his hands never pausing in their work. He would finish this current section before stopping, bringing the stripe to a natural conclusion rather than interrupting mid-pattern. Osric had already begun tidying his workspace, preparing to end his day's labor. The boy moved efficiently, gathering stray threads and checking that everything was secure on his loom before covering it with a length of old cloth that protected the work from dust overnight. These habits of care had been instilled from his first days as an apprentice, and they had become second nature through consistent practice. The brown stripe grew beneath Alden's hands, approaching the width that would balance properly with the cream sections. His eye measured the proportions automatically, no counting or marking needed after decades of creating similar patterns. The knowledge lived in his body now, in the slight adjustments of tension and spacing that happened below the level of conscious thought. A cart rumbled past on the street outside, its wooden wheels creaking under a heavy load. Alden recognized the sound. It would be the miller returning from his day's deliveries. The cart now empty, but for a few sacks of flour left unsold. The regular passage of familiar vehicles and people provided structure to the day, marking time through their predictable appearances and departures. The shuttle completed another pass, and Alden realized he had reached the natural stopping point he had been seeking. The stripe was complete, the pattern balanced, and his hands had brought the cloth to a place where it could rest overnight without disruption. He set down the shuttle and stood, stretching his back and shoulders, feeling the pleasant tiredness that came from honest labor. Osric had finished his preparations and stood waiting respectfully near the door. Alden nodded to the boy, releasing him for the evening. The apprentice offered a brief farewell and departed, his footsteps fading as he made his way home through the darkening streets. The workshop fell silent except for the distant sounds of the town settling into evening. Alden moved through his own closing routine, checking the loom's tension one final time, ensuring no tools had been left where they might be damaged or cause hazard in the morning darkness. He closed the shutters partway, leaving enough gap for air to circulate while preventing rain from entering should the weather change overnight. These small acts of care extended the life of his tools and materials, preventing problems before they could develop. He paused at the workshop door, looking back at the loom that dominated the space. The partially completed cloth stretched across its frame, waiting patiently for morning's resumption of work. In the dimming light, the stripes of brown and cream created a pattern that was both simple and satisfying, honest cloth that would serve its purpose without pretension. His gaze lingered on the familiar scene, the solid wooden frame of the loom, the neat arrangement of tools and materials, the smooth stone floor worn by generations of weavers' feet. This space had been his world for most of his 41 years, and he felt no restlessness or desire for change. The workshop held everything he needed, provided everything that mattered. He climbed the narrow stairs to the living quarters, his hand trailing along the stone wall for balance in the shadows. The steps were worn smooth in their centers, shaped by countless passages over the decades. Each footfall brought him closer to the warmth and light of the family space above, where Margaret waited with the evening meal. The upper room glowed with firelight from the hearth, and a single oil lamp burned on the table where Margaret had set out wooden bowls and spoons. The pottage simmered in an iron pot hung over the fire, its contents sending up wisps of steam that carried the rich scent of vegetables and grain. A loaf of bread waited on a board, and beside it stood a pitcher of ale. Margaret looked up as he entered, her work-worn hands setting aside the mending she had been doing by lamplight. Her brown hair, streaked with gray, caught the fire's glow, and her familiar face held the same quiet competence that had drawn him to her when they were young. She gestured toward the table in silent invitation, and Alden moved to wash his hands in the basin she had prepared. The water was cool against his skin, washing away the day's accumulation of wool fibers and dust. He dried his hands on a length of linen, then joined Margaret at the table. They sat together in the comfortable silence of long partnership, and she ladled pottage into his bowl, the steam rising in gentle spirals that caught the lamplight. The first taste brought simple satisfaction, barley cooked until tender, cabbage and leeks flavored with a bit of salt and herbs from Margaret's garden. The bread was dense and hearty, perfect for soaking up the pottage's liquid. The ale washed it all down smoothly, its slight bitterness complementing the meal's earthy flavors. They ate without hurry, occasionally exchanging brief observations about the day. Margaret mentioned that the neighbor's cow had calved successfully. Alden spoke of Osric's improving technique. The conversation required no great depth or complexity. It was simply the sharing of lives lived in parallel, the comfortable exchange of two people who knew each other thoroughly and required no pretense. Outside the window, night had nearly arrived. The sky held only the faintest remnants of daylight, a thin band of pale blue on the western horizon that would soon surrender to darkness. Stars had begun to appear overhead, faint at first but growing brighter as the sky darkened. The town around them settled into evening's quieter rhythms, voices growing softer, activities moving indoors, the business of the day giving way to rest. After the meal, Margaret cleared the table while Alden sat by the fire, feeling the day's pleasant weariness settle into his bones. His hands rested on his knees, and he watched the flames dance over the logs, their light casting shifting shadows on the walls. The fire's warmth soaked into his muscles, releasing tensions he had not consciously noticed, bringing a deeper level of relaxation. He thought about tomorrow's work, the continuation of the cloth he had begun. The pattern would proceed as it had today, stripe by stripe, until the piece reached its full length. Then there would be another piece to start, another pattern to create, the cycle continuing as it had throughout his working life. The predictability held no tedium. Instead, it provided structure and purpose, a framework within which skill could be exercised and craft perfected. Margaret joined him by the fire, bringing her mending to work on in the firelight. Her needle moved with the same steady rhythm that characterized his shuttle's passage, her hands as practiced in their craft as his were in weaving. They sat together in companionable quiet, each occupied with familiar tasks, the evening wrapping around them like a comfortable blanket. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the rafters overhead, a mouse scratched at something, its tiny sounds barely audible. These small noises formed the texture of home, the familiar soundscape that meant safety and belonging. Alden's eyelids grew heavy, his body recognizing that the day's work was complete and rest had been earned. Soon he would climb into the bed they shared, the straw mattress that had conformed over years to the shape of their bodies. He would pull the wool blankets up against the night's mild chill, and sleep would come easily, as it always did after a day of honest labor. His dreams, if he remembered them, would be simple and peaceful, populated by threads and looms and the gentle rhythms of his craft. But for now, he simply sat by the fire, his 41 years of life settling around him like accumulated cloth on a loom beam. Margaret's presence nearby provided quiet comfort, and the day's work provided satisfaction. The fire burned steadily, and outside, the town of 1243 slept peacefully beneath the stars, wrapped in the cloth woven by hands like his, warmed by the labor of countless craftsmen pursuing their trades with patient care. The fire had burned down to glowing embers by the time Margaret set aside her mending. She rose and moved about the room with quiet efficiency, banking the coals to preserve them for morning's rekindling, checking that the shutters were secure against the night air. Alden watched her familiar movements with the appreciation born of long years together, each gesture as known to him as the passage of his own shuttle through the loom. He stood and stretched once more, feeling the pleasant heaviness in his limbs that signaled readiness for sleep. The day had been good, productive without strain, peaceful without emptiness. His work-reddened hands had created several more inches of solid cloth, and tomorrow would bring the opportunity to continue that creation. The thought brought him contentment as he prepared for rest. The sleeping chamber occupied a corner of the upper room, separated from the main living space by a wooden partition that provided privacy, without blocking the warmth from the hearth. Margaret had already turned down the blankets on their bed, and Alden could see the pale linen of the sheets in the dim light that filtered through from the main room. He removed his tunic and hung it on a peg driven into the wall, then sat on the edge of the bed to remove his shoes. The leather was soft and worn, shaped by years of wear to fit his feet perfectly. He set them aside carefully, knowing they would be needed again come morning when the day's work began anew. The straw mattress rustled softly as he lay down, the familiar sound and sensation welcoming him into rest. Margaret joined him moments later, and they arranged themselves in the positions they had occupied for countless nights. She on the side nearest the partition, he closer to the outer wall where he could feel the slight coolness of the stone through the plaster. The wool blankets settled over them with comfortable weight, their texture slightly rough but warm, woven from the same material Alden worked with daily. He could identify the weave pattern by touch alone, recognizing it as the work of a weaver he knew from the other side of town, a woman who favored a particular type of twill that created especially warm fabric. Through the partition, the last glow of the banked fire provided minimal light, just enough to see the outline of the rafters overhead. Alden's eyes traced these familiar shapes, the heavy beams that had supported this roof for generations, and would continue to do so for generations more. There was comfort in such permanence, in being part of something larger and longer lasting than a single life. Margaret's breathing had already begun to slow and deepen, her body surrendering quickly to sleep after the day's labors. Alden listened to this sound, as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and felt his own breathing begin to match her rhythm. The synchronization happened without conscious effort, a natural harmonizing that came from sharing bed and life for so many years. His thoughts drifted like wool fibers floating through the workshop air, settling gently without pattern or purpose. He thought of the cloth waiting on his loom, of Osric's improving skill, of the way afternoon light had gilded everything it touched. These images floated through his mind without demanding attention, simply present and then gone, replaced by others equally gentle and inconsequential. The town outside had grown quiet, the daytime sounds of commerce and activity replaced by the softer noises of night. Somewhere a dog barked once briefly, then fell silent. The wind stirred through the narrow streets, carrying scents from gardens and kitchens, from the river that flowed past the town walls, from fields beyond where grain stood ripening in the darkness. Alden's body relaxed incrementally, tension releasing from muscles that had worked steadily throughout the day. His shoulders sank deeper into the mattress, his hands uncurled from their habitual weaver's position, his jaw loosened. The progression toward sleep was as natural and inevitable as sunset, requiring no effort, simply allowing what wanted to happen. He became aware of small sensations, the slight pressure of the blanket against his chest, the coolness of the air on his face, the warmth where Margaret's presence nearby radiated through the bedding. These physical experiences anchored him in the present moment while simultaneously releasing him from the need to remain alert or responsive. His breathing deepened further, each inhalation bringing the familiar sense of home, wool and wood smoke, the faint herb smell from Margaret's garden that clung to the drying bundles hung from the rafters, the clean scent of the linen sheets. Each exhalation released the day more completely, letting it slip away into memory where it would join all the other days of peaceful labor and simple satisfaction. The mattress beneath him seemed to soften and support him more completely, as if the straw were adjusting to cradle his 41-year-old body with particular care. The weight of the blankets felt less like pressure and more like embrace, a gentle holding that allowed complete surrender to rest. His mind drifted to the loom again, but now the image was dreamy and indistinct, the shuttle moving through threads that seemed to shimmer and flow like water, the cloth growing not just in length but in all directions, expanding into something vast and encompassing. The boundary between weaver and loom blurred, and he felt as if he himself were becoming thread, being woven into some larger pattern he could not quite perceive. The thought brought no confusion or concern, only a sense of rightness, of being exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. His life's work had meaning not because it was grand or unusual, but because it was part of the endless human effort to create warmth and protection, to transform raw materials into useful beauty. Margaret shifted slightly beside him, a small movement that barely disturbed the bedding, and the sound of her breathing continued its steady rhythm. The familiarity of her presence allowed him to release even the last traces of awareness, knowing that he was safe, that all was well, that tomorrow would bring another day of purposeful work in a life that had found its proper pattern. The darkness behind his closed eyelids seemed to deepen and soften simultaneously, becoming not an absence of light but a presence of rest. His body grew heavier and lighter at the same time, weighted by relaxation, yet somehow floating, suspended between waking and sleeping in that gentle threshold where consciousness begins its nightly dissolution. The last threads of thought unwound and drifted away. The shuttle of awareness made its final pass and came to rest. The loom of consciousness stood quiet and still, its work complete for now, ready to resume when morning's light called it back to activity. Alden's breathing matched the ancient rhythm of sleep, deep and slow and effortless. His hands, those work-reddened hands that had served him faithfully through decades of labor, lay relaxed and open on the blanket. His face smoothed into the peaceful expression of one who has earned his rest and found it waiting, exactly where it should be. The town slept around him, hundreds of souls resting in their beds, preparing for tomorrow's work. The loom in the workshop below stood silent and patient, its threads waiting for morning's resumption of the weaving. The cloth wrapped on the beam held the day's progress, each stripe a record of hours spent in careful attention to an ancient craft. And in the sleeping chamber, Alden drifted deeper into rest, his 41 years of life settling into peaceful stillness. The wool blanket rose and fell with his breathing, gentle as the passage of a shuttle through waiting threads. The night wrapped around him like finished cloth, warm and protective, holding him safely until dawn would call him back to his beloved work. His last conscious awareness was of deep contentment, that emotional baseline that had carried him through all his days, now accompanying him into sleep's peaceful territory. The sensation was like being woven into rest itself, each breath a thread, each heartbeat a pass of the shuttle, until sleep and self became one continuous fabric, whole and complete and perfectly at peace. The fire's last ember glowed softly in the darkness, then faded into ash. The stars turned slowly overhead in their ancient patterns. The river flowed past the town walls with its eternal murmur, and in the weaver's house on the narrow lane, all was quiet, all was rest, all was exactly as it should be. The night deepened around the town, settling like layers of wool felt pressing gently into place. In the sleeping chamber, Alden had surrendered completely to rest, his breathing so slow, and even it barely stirred the air. The darkness held him softly, and dreams came in gentle waves, images of thread and light, of hands moving through familiar patterns, of cloth growing endlessly under patient care. Margaret slept beside him in equal peace, her day's work also complete, her rest well earned. The house around them creaked occasionally as wooden beams contracted in the night's cooler air, small sounds that spoke of shelter and safety rather than any cause for concern. These were the voices of home, as familiar as breathing, requiring no attention yet somehow comforting in their presence. The stars outside continued their slow wheel across the sky, marking time in the ancient manner that predated any human measurement. The constellation the townspeople called the Weaver's Shuttle hung low in the southern sky, its pattern of stars said to resemble the tool Alden used each day. He had often looked at those stars on clear nights, finding pleasure in the connection between earthly craft and celestial arrangement. In the workshop below, the loom stood in darkness, its form barely visible in the faint starlight that filtered through the partially closed shutters. The warp threads stretched taut and silent, holding their tension without complaint, waiting with the infinite patience of inanimate things for the hands that would bring them purpose and motion. The partially completed cloth rested on its beam, each stripe a testament to hours of careful attention. The town around them slept deeply now, the last lights extinguished, the last voices fallen silent. Only the night watch remained awake, making their rounds through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing off stone walls and cobblestones. The sound of their passage was rhythmic and reassuring, a reminder that order and safety prevailed even in darkness. A cat moved through the shadows near Alden's workshop, the same gray tabby that had visited during the afternoon. The creature prowled with purpose, hunting mice that emerged from their hiding places once human activity ceased. This nightly drama unfolded without witness, predator and prey following patterns as old as their species, each playing their role in the endless cycle of life that continued regardless of human awareness. The river beyond the town walls flowed steadily, its current unchanged by day or night, its waters carrying leaves and branches and small fish toward the sea that lay many miles distant. The sound of its passage was too far away to be heard in Alden's sleeping chamber, but it was there nonetheless, constant and eternal, providing water for the town's wells and mills, connecting this place to all the others along its course. In his sleep, Alden's hands moved slightly, fingers twitching in small motions that echoed his day's work. The body continued its conversation with craft even in rest, muscles rehearsing patterns they knew so thoroughly that consciousness was unnecessary. His face remained peaceful, his breathing undisturbed by these small movements, his rest unbroken. The moon had risen late, and now it climbed slowly above the rooftops, casting silver light across the sleeping town. Its illumination transformed familiar shapes into something mysterious and beautiful. Chimneys became towers. Shadows became pools of darkness so complete they seemed solid, and the cobblestones gleamed like water. This nocturnal world existed parallel to the daylight town, known only to those who stayed awake to witness it. Margaret stirred in her sleep, turning slightly and pulling the blanket more closely around her shoulders. The movement was unconscious, her body adjusting itself for continued comfort without waking. Alden remained still beside her, his 41 years of sleeping in this bed having taught his body exactly how to rest without disturbing his partner. Even in sleep, they accommodated each other with the ease of long practice. The wool blanket that covered them had been woven years ago, its fibers softened by countless washings and the natural oils of human skin. It had developed the particular texture that only time and use could create, becoming more comfortable with each passing season. The fabric held their warmth efficiently, creating a small island of comfort in the cool night air. In the rafters overhead, small creatures nested and rested, sparrows that had found their way in through gaps in the eaves, and the mice that Margaret waged constant gentle war against during daylight hours. These uninvited residents lived their own lives in the spaces between human awareness, emerging at night to forage, and then retreating before dawn brought the household back to wakefulness. The night air carried different scents than the day. The wool smell from the workshop mixed with the earthy dampness that rose as temperatures dropped, with wood smoke from banked fires throughout the town, with the green scent of growing things in gardens and fields. These aromas layered and blended, creating the particular perfume of a medieval town at night, unique to this place and time. Alden's breathing continued its deep, regular pattern, each inhalation and exhalation marking the passage of seconds that accumulated into minutes. His heart beat steadily in his chest, pumping blood through vessels that had served him faithfully since birth. Every system in his body worked in harmony, performing the essential tasks that sustained life while consciousness rested and restored itself. His dreams shifted and changed like patterns on a loom, one image giving way to another without logic or narrative. He saw his father at the loom, though the man had been dead for 10 years. He saw Osric as an old man, though the boy was still young and learning. He saw cloth stretching endlessly across a landscape, becoming fields and sky and water. The images brought neither joy nor sorrow, simply existing in the dream space where normal rules of time and possibility did not apply. The banked fire in the main room released occasional small sounds, a settled log shifting position, a pocket of sap popping quietly, ash falling through the grate. These noises were too soft to wake anyone, but they added to the subtle soundscape of the night, the barely audible symphony of a house at rest. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, moving through the narrow streets with a sound like distant breathing. It carried leaves along the cobblestones, rattled shutters gently on their hinges, and brought the scent of rain that might fall before morning. The weather changed its patterns without regard to human schedules, following its own ancient rhythms of heat and cold, moisture, and dryness. Margaret's breathing had achieved the deepest level of sleep, her body completely relaxed, her mind far away in dreams of her own. She rested as thoroughly as the earth itself rested between seasons, gathering strength for the next cycle of activity. Her work-worn hands lay curled loosely on the pillow, released from their daily tasks of cooking and mending and maintaining the household. The moon continued its climb, reaching toward its zenith where it would hang for a brief time before beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Its light shifted as it moved, illuminating different parts of the town, casting new shadows and erasing old ones. This eternal dance of light and shadow proceeded whether anyone watched or not, a performance given nightly for an audience that was usually asleep. Alden's face in sleep showed the effects of his 41 years, lines around his eyes from years of close work in varying light, weathering on his cheeks from exposure to sun and wind, the deepening of features that came with middle age. But these marks told the story of a life well lived, of honest labor and simple pleasures, of challenges met and responsibilities fulfilled. His face in repose held a dignity that had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with integrity and purpose. The straw in the mattress beneath them had compressed over the years, creating a depression that perfectly fit their bodies. This customized surface provided support exactly where it was needed, cradling them in familiar comfort. The linen sheets, though coarse by modern standards, had been softened by repeated laundering and use, becoming gentle against skin. Time flowed onward through the darkness, measured by nothing except the stars' progression and the moon's arc. Minutes became hours, though no one in the sleeping house marked the transition. Night deepened toward that darkest hour that comes before dawn, when the world seems most completely given over to rest and restoration. In his deep sleep, Alden had passed beyond dreaming into that profound rest where consciousness dissolved entirely. His body performed its restorative work, repairing small damages from the day's activities, consolidating memories, preparing systems for the next cycle of waking. This was the body's time, when it could attend to its own needs without the demands of conscious activity. The town around them slept in similar depth, hundreds of people resting in their beds, each dreaming their own dreams or sinking into dreamless peace. Apprentices and masters, merchants and laborers, the wealthy and the modest, all were equal in sleep's democracy, all released from their roles and responsibilities into the simple state of being alive and resting. The gray cat had caught its mouse and retreated to some hidden place to consume its prize. The night watch had passed through this quarter of town and moved on to the next. The river continued its eternal flow. The stars turned overhead, and in the weaver's house, Alden slept on in perfect peace, his rest as complete and satisfying as his day's work had been. His 41 years of life folded gently into the darkness like finished cloth wrapped around its beam. The deepest part of night held the town in complete stillness. Even the wind had subsided to barely a whisper, and the air seemed to have grown thicker, more substantial, as if darkness itself possessed weight and texture. In the sleeping chamber, Alden rested beyond all dreams now, in that profound state where the self seemed to merge with the quietness surrounding it. His breathing had become so gentle it was nearly imperceptible, each breath a shallow tide that ebbed and flowed without effort or intention. The blanket over his chest rose and fell in movements so slight they barely disturbed the wool's surface. His face had smoothed into an expression of absolute peace. All the small tensions that even relaxed waking held now completely released. Margaret slept with equal depth beside him, her presence a warmth he could sense even in unconsciousness. Their years together had created a bond that transcended awareness, so that even in sleep they oriented toward each other, their bodies maintaining proximity without conscious choice. The bed they shared had become a small world unto itself, a place of safety and restoration that had witnessed thousands of nights of shared rest. The wooden partition that separated their sleeping area from the main room stood solid and dark, its surface invisible in the night's completeness. Beyond it, the banked fire had dimmed to the faintest glow, barely enough to show that embers still lived beneath the ash. The heat it provided had lessened, and the room's temperature had dropped to match the cool night air outside, but the blankets provided sufficient warmth that no discomfort penetrated the sleeper's rest. In the workshop below, the loom waited with the patience of wood and fiber. The threads stretched across its frame held their tension without change, neither loosening nor tightening, simply existing in the state Alden had left them. The partially completed cloth bore the record of his day's labor, each stripe a chapter in the ongoing story of creation through craft, each thread a word in a language older than writing. The moon had reached its highest point and begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. Its light now entered the sleeping chamber from a different angle, creating new patterns of illumination and shadow. A single beam fell across the floor near the bed, silvering the wooden planks and making them appear almost luminous. But this light did not penetrate Alden's closed eyelids or disturb the completeness of his rest. Somewhere in the town, a rooster stirred on its perch, sensing in some mysterious way that dawn approached, though hours remained before the first hint of light would touch the eastern sky. The bird shifted position, ruffled its feathers, then settled back into its own rest. Its time to announce the day had not yet arrived, and instinct kept it silent in the continuing darkness. The night watch had completed their rounds and gathered at their station near the market square, where they would remain until dawn released them from duty. They spoke in low voices about inconsequential matters, sharing bread and ale to ward off the chill and tedium of the long hours. Their vigilance allowed others to sleep without concern, providing the security that let Alden and his fellow townspeople surrender completely to rest. The river beyond the walls continued its eternal conversation with its banks, water sliding over stones that had been shaped by centuries of such passage. Fish rested in deeper pools, suspended in the current with minimal effort, their own form of sleep. Reeds along the margins bent and straightened as small currents moved past them, a gentle nodding that continued hour after hour without cease. Alden's hands had relaxed completely now, lying open on the blanket with fingers slightly curled, as if even in sleep they remembered the shape of the shuttle they would hold again come morning. His calloused palms showed pale in the moonlight that found its way into the room, the marks of his trade visible even in this dim illumination. These hands had created so much cloth over the years, had guided so many thousands of threads into their proper patterns. His work-reddened fingers twitched once, very slightly, then fell still again. Whatever dream or neural impulse had caused the movement passed without waking him, leaving his rest undisturbed. The body's small adjustments and recalibrations continued beneath the threshold of consciousness, maintaining comfort and health while the mind ranged far away in regions beyond memory or description. The wool blanket covering him and Margaret had developed its own landscape of small hills and valleys, conforming to the shape of their bodies beneath. The fabric held warmth close to their skin, while allowing enough air circulation to prevent overheating. Its texture against his cheek was soft from years of use, and his sleeping mind registered this comfort without forming it into thought. In the main room, the herbs hanging from the rafters swayed slightly in air currents too subtle to be called drafts. Rosemary and thyme, lavender and mint. Their dried leaves still held traces of summer's growing season, and the faintest hint of their scents drifted through the darkness. These aromas blended with the ever-present smell of wool and wood smoke, creating the particular perfume that meant home to Alden's sleeping consciousness. The stars outside had wheeled further in their courses, constellations rising in the east as others descended toward the western horizon. The great celestial loom continued its own weaving, creating patterns that ancient peoples had named and modern ones still recognized. The same stars had looked down on weavers for countless generations, watching as the craft passed from hand to hand, from father to son, maintaining its essential nature even as tools and techniques slowly evolved. Margaret made a small sound in her sleep, something between a sigh and a murmur, then fell silent again. Her breathing resumed its steady rhythm, and whatever brief disturbance had passed through her dreams left no lasting trace. She nestled slightly deeper into the mattress, her body seeking the position of maximum comfort with the same unconscious wisdom that guided Alden's hands at the loom. The darkness in the sleeping chamber seemed to have depth and layers, as if night were not simply an absence of light, but a presence in itself. The quality of this darkness was different from what could be experienced with eyes closed in daylight. It was complete and encompassing, a tangible thing that wrapped around consciousness and drew it down into deeper rest. Alden's 41 years had taught his body exactly how to sleep, how to release completely into restoration's embrace. His mind had learned which concerns could be set aside until morning, and which required no concern at all. The wisdom of experience allowed him to rest more thoroughly than he had in youth, when anxieties and uncertainties often disturbed the night. Now his life's pattern was established and comfortable, his days productive and satisfying, and sleep came as naturally as the shuttle's passage through waiting threads. The town around them had settled into its own deepest rest. No lights showed in any window, no voices called through the streets, no animals moved about their business. Even the dogs that normally prowled and barked had found their own sleeping places and surrendered to the night. The collective exhalation of hundreds of sleeping souls created an atmosphere of peace, so profound it seemed to muffle even the smallest sounds. Time continued its flow, invisible and inexorable, carrying the night forward toward the moment when darkness would begin to lift and a new day would announce itself. But that moment remained distant still, and the present held only the deep peace of the hours between midnight and dawn, when the world rested most completely. Alden's face in sleep showed no dreams now, no movement behind closed eyelids, no small expressions flickering across his features. He had descended to that place beyond dreams, where consciousness dissolved so thoroughly that nothing remained but the simple fact of breathing, of being, of resting in the darkness like a seed resting in earth, gathering strength for eventual emergence into light. The straw mattress beneath him had warmed to his body's temperature, and the wool blanket above had done the same, so that he rested in a cocoon of perfect comfort. No part of him called for adjustment or attention. Every muscle had released its tension. Every joint had found its most restful position. His entire being had surrendered to sleep's restoration with the completeness that came from a life well lived and a day honestly completed. Margaret's breathing harmonized with his own, creating a gentle rhythm that filled the sleeping chamber with the sound of shared rest. Two lives that had intertwined over decades now rested side by side, separate yet connected, individual yet partnership, each complete in themselves yet more complete together. The night deepened impossibly further, and Alden slept on in perfect peace, his rest as profound as the darkness, his consciousness as far away as the stars, his body as still as the loom waiting below. The hours of night continued their progression, carrying him gently forward through the darkness toward the morning that would eventually come, when light would return and work would resume, and the shuttle would pass once more through waiting threads, continuing the ancient pattern that gave his life meaning and purpose and deep, abiding contentment. The night had reached that peculiar depth where time itself seemed to pause, suspended between the day that had passed and the one yet to come. In this space of complete stillness, Alden rested beyond all awareness, his sleep so profound that he had become one with the darkness surrounding him. His breathing continued its shallow rhythm, so gentle that each breath seemed less an action than a whisper of existence itself. The moon had begun its descent in earnest now, its light shifting gradually as it moved toward the western horizon. The silvered beam that had illuminated the floorboards near the bed had moved with the moon's passage, climbing slowly up the wooden partition that separated sleeping space from main room. Soon it would reach the rafters and then disappear entirely as the moon sank below the roofline. In the absolute quiet of the house, small sounds became apparent that would never be noticed during the day's activity. The settling of old timbers as they responded to the night's temperature, the faint scratching of a mouse in the walls, the almost imperceptible movement of air through gaps in the shutters. These tiny sounds formed a tapestry of near silence that was itself a kind of music. Margaret had shifted slightly in her sleep, turning toward Alden so that her breath stirred the air between them. Her work-worn hands rested near her face now, one tucked beneath her cheek, the other lying loosely on the blanket. In sleep, the lines of care and labor that marked her features during waking hours had softened, and her face held the peaceful simplicity of a child's rest. The wool blanket that covered them both had developed small wrinkles and folds where it draped over their forms, creating a landscape in miniature across its surface. Each crease caught the fading moonlight differently, some edges bright where the light struck directly, others lost in shadow. The fabric rose and fell with their breathing in a gentle rhythm that matched the eternal pulse of life itself. Alden's body continued its restorative work in the depths of sleep. Blood circulated through his limbs, carrying away the small accumulations of the day's labor and bringing fresh nourishment to every cell. His muscles, which had held tension through hours at the loom, now released completely, becoming soft and yielding. Even the smallest muscles in his face and hands had surrendered their grip, allowing his features to rest in absolute neutrality. His mind had traveled far from the concerns of waking life. No thoughts of cloth or patterns or daily responsibilities disturbed this deep rest. Instead, his consciousness floated in a space beyond words or images, a place of pure being where nothing needed to be done or understood or remembered. This was the body's time for healing, the mind's time for sorting through the day's experiences and filing them away into memory's vast storehouse. The workshop below remained wrapped in its own darkness, the loom standing like a patient sentinel over the partially completed cloth. The warp threads held their tension without complaint, neither gaining nor losing their careful balance. The shuttle rested where Alden had placed it, its smooth boxwood surface cool now in the night air, waiting for the warm touch of his hand to bring it back to life and purpose. Outside, the stars continued their ancient wheeling across the heavens. The constellation they called the Weaver's Shuttle had moved from its position earlier in the night, following the eternal pattern that had guided travelers and marked seasons since humans first looked upward and tried to find meaning in the scattered lights above. These same stars had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the building of great cathedrals, the quiet daily labor of countless craftsmen in countless workshops. A cloud passed across the moon's face, dimming its light briefly before moving on. The shadow it cast swept across the town like a gentle hand passing over a sleeping child's face, there, and gone so quickly it barely registered as change. The moonlight returned, perhaps slightly diminished but still sufficient to silver the world with its cool illumination. The night air had grown cooler as the hours progressed, and now a genuine chill had settled over the town. But inside the sleeping chamber, the blankets provided ample protection, and Alden and Margaret remained comfortably warm. Their combined body heat created a small island of warmth in the bed, a refuge against the night's growing cold. Alden's graying beard, mentioned early in the day when light had revealed its coloring, now disappeared into shadow, becoming merely a texture against his face rather than a visible feature. His work-reddened hands, those tools of his trade that had served him so faithfully, lay still and peaceful, their calluses and rough patches invisible in the darkness. In sleep, stripped of the defining characteristics visible by daylight, he became simply a man resting, indistinguishable from any other sleeper in the town. The fire in the main room had dimmed to its last faint glow, the embers barely clinging to life beneath their covering of ash. By morning, Margaret would need to coax new flames from these dying coals, feeding them with kindling and breath until fire returned to warm the household. But that task lay hours in the future, and for now the embers simply existed, neither growing nor quite dying, suspended in their own form of rest. In the rafters, the small birds that nested there had fluffed their feathers against the cold, creating additional insulation as they slept. Their tiny hearts beat rapidly even in rest, maintaining the high metabolism that allowed them to fly and sing and live their brief, bright lives. They would wake with the first hint of dawn, their internal clocks more accurate than any human timepiece, and begin their morning chorus while the town still slumbered. The mice in the walls had completed their nocturnal foraging and retreated to their nests, where they huddled together for warmth. These small creatures lived their entire lives in the spaces between human awareness, emerging when people slept and hiding when they woke. Their world overlapped with Alden's but rarely intersected, existing in parallel like the warp and weft of cloth, crossing but never truly meeting. Margaret's breathing had achieved a perfect steadiness, each inhalation and exhalation identical to the one before, creating a rhythm so regular it could have been measured by it. This was the breathing of complete rest, untroubled by dreams or discomfort, the body functioning in perfect autonomy while consciousness ranged far away. Her chest rose and fell beneath the blanket in movements barely visible even in moonlight, life continuing its essential processes with effortless grace. Alden's 41 years had given him a body that knew how to rest as thoroughly as it knew how to work. His skeleton had aligned itself into the position that placed least stress on joints and spine. His internal organs continued their functions at the reduced rate appropriate for deep sleep. His brain had entered the phase of rest where restoration happened most effectively, where the day's experiences were processed and integrated, where the self that would wake in the morning was being quietly prepared. The town around them slept in similar depth, though each household contained its own variations of rest. In some homes, infants nursed and slept in cycles, their needs following rhythms different from adult patterns. In others, the elderly lay awake in the darkness, sleep having become elusive with advancing years. But most, like Alden and Margaret, rested in that profound middle-of-night sleep that was the body's deepest restoration. The cobblestones in the street outside had cooled considerably, releasing the warmth they had absorbed during the day. Their surfaces held a thin film of moisture now, condensation forming as the temperature dropped. This dampness would make them slightly slippery come morning, but it would evaporate quickly once sunlight returned to warm them again. The cycle repeated endlessly, day warming, night cooling, the stones absorbing and releasing heat in an eternal rhythm. The river beyond the walls maintained its steady flow, its current unchanged by the hour or the season or the temperature of the air above it. Fish still rested in their pools, and the reeds still bent to the water's movement, and the sound of its passage remained constant. The river cared nothing for human sleep or waking, following only the ancient pull of gravity that drew it ever toward the distant sea. Inside the sleeping chamber, Alden had passed beyond even the deepest layer of normal sleep into a state so profound it approached the stillness of inanimate things. His consciousness had dissolved so completely that if asked, he could not have said whether he was or was not, whether time passed or stood still, whether he existed as a separate self, or had merged entirely with the darkness surrounding him. This was rest at its most complete, restoration at its most thorough, peace at its most absolute. His face showed no expression whatsoever now, neither peaceful nor troubled, simply neutral and still. His lips were slightly parted, allowing breath to enter and leave with minimal resistance. His eyelids remained motionless over eyes that no longer moved in dreams, Every part of him had surrendered to rest's dominion, accepting sleep's gift of temporary dissolution and renewal. Margaret beside him rested with equal completeness, her own consciousness as far away as his, her body as thoroughly relaxed. They lay together in the bed they had shared for years, two separate beings whose lives had intertwined so completely that even in this profound sleep, some part of them remained aware of and oriented toward each other. Partnership had become part of their very nature, woven into the fabric of who they were as thoroughly as threads were woven into cloth. The night continued its slow progression toward the distant moment when darkness would begin to lift. But that moment remained far off still, and the present held only this: two people sleeping in perfect peace, wrapped in wool blankets in a stone house in a medieval town, their rest as deep as the night, their breathing as regular as the passage of the shuttle through the Loom, their lives temporarily suspended in darkness like cloth waiting on the beam for morning's light to reveal its pattern. The darkness had reached that point where it seemed it could deepen no further, yet somehow it did. In the sleeping chamber, Alden rested in a state beyond description, his body so still it might have been carved from the same wood as his loom. His breathing continued, barely perceptible, each breath a testament to life's persistence even in the deepest rest. The moon had sunk lower still, and its light no longer reached the sleeping chamber at all. Complete darkness filled the space now, so absolute that even eyes adjusted to night could discern nothing. In this void of light, other senses might have become heightened during waking, but in sleep even those had dimmed to near nothingness. Only the most essential functions continued: breath, heartbeat, the slow circulation of blood. Margaret's presence beside him was felt rather than seen, perceived through the warmth she radiated and the slight depression in the mattress where her weight rested. Their years together had created an awareness that transcended the need for sight or sound. Even in the deepest sleep, some ancient part of the mind knew where the other lay, maintained that connection without conscious thought. The straw beneath them had compressed over the hours of lying still, creating an even more customized support. The fibers had shifted and settled, distributing their combined weight in the manner that caused least pressure on any single point. This was the mattress at its most comfortable, having adjusted fully to the bodies it supported, providing rest as complete as the darkness surrounding them. Alden's calloused fingers had curled slightly more as sleep deepened, his hands drawing inward in a gentle protective gesture that happened without awareness. The position was natural and unstrained, simply the body's tendency to curl slightly inward during the deepest rest. His work-reddened hands bore the marks of his trade even now, the calluses and rough patches that would never fully smooth, permanent evidence of decades at the loom. In the main room beyond the partition, the fire's last ember finally surrendered its hold on life and faded into cold ash. The transition happened without sound or ceremony, simply a gradual dimming until no light remained at all. The room's temperature would drop more noticeably now without even that minimal heat source, but morning was near enough that the cold would not become uncomfortable before Margaret rose to rekindle the fire. The wooden beams overhead contracted minutely as the temperature fell, creating the occasional small creak that spoke of the house's living nature. Wood never truly became still. It responded to moisture and temperature, expanding and contracting in subtle ways, breathing in its own fashion. These ancient timbers had witnessed thousands of nights like this one, supporting the roof that sheltered generations of weavers and their families. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness held a different quality than the midnight hours. Though no light yet showed in the eastern sky, something in the air had shifted. The night had reached its conclusion and begun the imperceptible transition toward day, though dawn remained distant enough that no bird yet stirred, no rooster crowed. No sign visible to human senses announced the coming change. The stars had wheeled further in their courses, some having set below the western horizon while others rose in the east. The great celestial dome continued its eternal rotation, indifferent to the sleeping town below. The constellation called the Weaver's Shuttle had descended far toward the horizon now, soon to disappear entirely until its return the following night. Alden's face in the complete darkness showed no tension, no expression of any kind. The muscles of his jaw had relaxed entirely. His lips remained slightly parted for easy breathing. His brow held no furrows. Sleep had smoothed away every trace of the day's activity and thought, leaving behind only the essential fact of a man resting, a body maintaining itself in the darkness while consciousness wandered in territories beyond recall. His 41 years had taught him the rhythm of rest and work, the balance between effort and restoration. His body knew how to extract the maximum benefit from sleep, how to surrender completely so that morning would find him refreshed and ready for the day's labor. This knowledge lived in his bones and blood, accumulated through decades of regular routine and honest labor. The wool blanket covering them had cooled slightly at its surface where it was exposed to the night air, but beneath, where it trapped their body heat, it remained warm and comforting. The contrast created layers of temperature, cool at the top, warm at the bottom, with gradations between. This natural insulation had served humans for centuries, wool's unique properties making it ideal for protection against cold. Margaret's breathing had maintained its perfect steadiness through all the hours of darkness. No dreams had troubled her rest. No discomfort had caused her to wake or shift position significantly. She slept with the thoroughness of someone whose days were filled with purposeful activity, whose conscience was clear, whose life followed patterns that brought satisfaction rather than regret or worry. The mice in the walls had fallen silent now, having returned to their nests where they huddled together for warmth as the temperature continued its slow decline. Their small, warm bodies pressed against each other, sharing heat in the ancient mammalian way, survival through community and cooperation. They would emerge again when humans began stirring, seeking the crumbs and scraps that inevitably fell during food preparation. In the workshop below, the loom stood unchanged and unchanging, its warped threads maintaining their tension with the reliability of inanimate things. The partially completed cloth held the record of Alden's previous day's work, each stripe marking hours of patient labor, each thread representing a single passage of the shuttle through the shed. The cloth waited without impatience, simply existing in its incomplete state until the weaver's hands would return to continue its creation. The shuttle itself rested on its shelf, its boxwood body cool now, all the warmth from Alden's handling having dissipated into the night air. In the morning, his hands would restore that warmth, would bring the tool back to life through use. But for now it was merely wood, shaped and smoothed but inactive, potential without action, tool without purpose until the craftsman returned. The town around them had entered that deepest quiet that comes in the hours before dawn, when even the night watch grew drowsy at their posts, and the dogs had all found warm places to sleep. No sound carried through the empty streets, no light showed in any window. The collective rest of hundreds of souls created an atmosphere of peace, so profound it seemed almost tangible, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of so much unconsciousness. Alden's body continued its invisible work of restoration, cells repairing microscopic damage, muscles processing the accumulated fatigue of the day's repetitive motions, his brain organizing memories and consolidating learning. All of this happened without his awareness or participation, the body's wisdom carrying out its essential functions, while consciousness remained far away in sleep's distant territory. His graying beard, barely visible even in moonlight hours earlier, had disappeared completely into the absolute darkness. His work-reddened hands, those faithful tools that had served him throughout his life, lay still and peaceful, neither grasping nor releasing, simply existing in rest. Every part of him had achieved the stillness that comes only in the deepest sleep, when the self temporarily dissolves and nothing remains but the basic fact of being alive. The hours had accumulated slowly, minute by minute, second by second, each one identical to those before and after, creating the vast stretch of darkness that separated one day from the next. Time flowed onward as it always did, neither hurrying nor delaying, simply progressing at its eternal rate while the world slept beneath the stars. Margaret stirred very slightly, some small shift in her body's position that happened far below the threshold of waking. The movement was so minimal it barely disturbed the blanket's surface, yet it spoke of the body's constant subtle adjustments, the small corrections that happened even in the deepest rest to maintain circulation and prevent any part from becoming uncomfortable through too long in one position. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own now, not actually changing but seeming to breathe, to possess some quality beyond mere absence of light. This was the darkness of the deepest night, when the world rested most completely, when the veil between sleep and waking grew thinnest, when consciousness could slip furthest from the body's constraints and wander in spaces that daylight never touched. Alden hummed no plain chant melodies now. That habitual behavior belonged to waking hours, to times when his hands worked at the loom and his mind needed the gentle accompaniment of familiar tunes. In sleep, he made no sound except the whisper of his breathing, and even that was so soft it barely stirred the air. He rested in complete silence, complete stillness, complete peace. His deep contentment, that emotional baseline that characterized his waking life, had dissolved into something even simpler, the contentment of the body at rest, the satisfaction of muscles released from effort, the peace of consciousness temporarily freed from the need to think or choose or act. This was rest at its purest, stripped of everything but the essential fact of being alive and breathing in the darkness. The night continued its hold on the world, and Alden slept on in perfect stillness, his 41 years folded into the darkness like finished cloth wrapped on its beam, his life temporarily suspended between the day that had passed and the one yet to come, existing purely in this eternal present moment of deep, dreamless, restorative sleep. The darkness had held for so long it seemed eternal, yet now, imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. The quality of the night changed in ways too subtle for sleeping senses to detect, but the change was real nonetheless. The earth continued its ancient rotation, carrying this part of the world gradually toward the sun's returning light. In the sleeping chamber, Alden remained deeply at rest, his breathing still shallow and regular, his body completely surrendered to sleep's embrace. His calloused fingers lay relaxed on the blanket, and his face showed no awareness of the coming transition from night to day. The darkness around him remained complete, but somewhere beyond the town walls, beyond the eastern horizon, dawn had begun its slow approach. The stars in the western sky had dimmed slightly, though no human eye watching could have marked the exact moment of change. The brightest among them still shone clearly, but the fainter ones had begun to fade into a sky that was no longer quite as black as it had been. The transformation was so gradual that it seemed less like change and more like a gentle revelation of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. Margaret's breathing had begun to shift very slightly, moving toward the lighter patterns that preceded waking, though she remained deeply asleep. Her body sensed the approach of morning with the accuracy that came from years of rising at the same hour, her internal rhythms attuned to the cycle of day and night. But full waking remained some time away, and for now she continued to rest, gathering the last measure of restoration before the new day's duties would call her back to consciousness. The mice in the walls had begun to stir, their own internal clocks signaling that the time for retreat approached. Soon humans would wake and move about, making the house unsafe for small foragers. They made their way back to their hidden nests with tiny scratching sounds that would have been inaudible to anyone awake, much less to the deeply sleeping occupants of the bed. In the rafters overhead, the first bird shifted on its perch. The creature had not yet opened its eyes or uttered any sound, but some deep instinct had registered the coming dawn. Its small body prepared itself for waking, its heartbeat increasing slightly, its muscles beginning the subtle transition from sleep's limpness to the readiness required for flight and song. The workshop below remained wrapped in darkness as complete as that in the sleeping chamber. The loom stood invisible in the blackness, but it waited as it had waited every night for decades, patient and reliable, ready to receive the weaver's hands and resume the work that had paused at day's end. The threads stretched across its frame held their tension unchanged, neither knowing nor caring whether darkness or light surrounded them. Alden's 41 years had trained his body to wake at the proper time without conscious effort. Even now, in the deepest sleep, some part of him tracked the passing hours and prepared for the moment when rest would end and the day's work would begin. But that moment had not yet arrived, and his sleep remained profound, his consciousness still far away in territories beyond thought or dream. The air in the sleeping chamber had grown quite cold now, the last vestiges of yesterday's warmth having dissipated entirely. But beneath the wool blanket, Alden and Margaret remained comfortably warm, their combined body heat trapped by the fabric's insulating properties. The contrast between the cold air on their faces and the warmth beneath the covers would make waking more difficult, the body's natural reluctance to leave comfort for chill. Outside, the night watch had grown alert again as their duty neared its end. They stamped their feet against the cold and spoke more frequently, keeping themselves awake through the last hour before they would be relieved. Their voices carried clearly in the pre-dawn stillness, but the sounds were too distant and muffled to penetrate the sleeping household or disturb its occupants' rest. The eastern horizon, invisible from the sleeping chamber but present nonetheless, had begun to show the faintest suggestion of change. Not light exactly, not yet, but a lessening of absolute darkness, a hint that somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the sun had begun its climb toward visibility. This was the hour when night acknowledged defeat while still maintaining its hold, when darkness admitted that dawn approached while refusing to surrender entirely. The river beyond the town walls continued its eternal flow, but now birds along its banks had begun to wake. A duck stirred in the reeds, and somewhere a heron stretched its long neck before settling back into watchful stillness. These creatures knew the rhythms of dawn perhaps better than any human, their lives more closely tied to the cycles of light and darkness, their survival depending on perfect timing. Alden's breathing had begun to change very subtly, the pattern shifting in ways that suggested his body's slow journey back toward consciousness. The change was barely perceptible, a slightly deeper breath here, a small movement of his head there, but the transition had begun. His sleep, while still deep, had passed its nadir and started the gradual ascent toward waking. His calloused fingers twitched once briefly, then fell still again. Some dream or neural firing had caused the movement, though the content of any dream had already faded beyond recall or perhaps had never formed into images that consciousness could have recognized. The twitch was merely the body beginning to reassert its claims, reminding the sleeping mind that a physical form waited to be reanimated and put to use. Margaret's face had changed expression slightly, her features no longer holding the complete neutrality of deepest sleep. A small furrow appeared between her brows, then smoothed away. Her work-worn hands shifted position on the pillow, fingers curling and uncurling as her body prepared for the transition back to waking life. The darkness in the room had not lightened. No trace of dawn had yet reached this interior space, but somehow the quality of the darkness had changed. It no longer felt as deep or as absolute, as if the night itself knew its time was ending and had begun the process of withdrawal, gathering its strength for the following evening when it would return to claim the world again. In the main room, the ashes of last night's fire lay cold and gray in the hearth. Margaret would need to clear these away and build a new fire from the embers she had carefully preserved beneath the ash. But first she would need to wake, and for now she remained suspended in that transitional state between deep sleep and full consciousness, her body preparing itself while her mind still wandered in sleep's territory. The town around them had begun its own subtle transition toward waking. Here and there, early risers had already left their beds, the baker who needed hours to prepare the day's bread, the dairyman whose cows waited for morning milking, the church sexton who must ring the bells for lauds. These few souls moved through the darkness with candles and lanterns, bringing small points of light into a world still dominated by night. But Alden's household remained at rest, the weaver and his wife gathering the last moments of sleep before the day would call them back to consciousness and labor. Their breathing continued its steady rhythm, and the blanket rose and fell with movements that were just beginning to suggest the deeper breaths that preceded waking. Alden's body had started producing the subtle chemical changes that would bring him back to awareness. His brain activity had begun to shift, moving from the deep patterns of profound sleep toward the lighter rhythms that would eventually result in consciousness. But the transition was gradual and gentle, allowing him to surface slowly rather than being jolted awake by any external disturbance. His work-reddened hands, which had lain so still through all the hours of darkness, now showed the first signs of returning tension. The muscles were beginning to remember their purposes, the nerves starting to fire in preparation for movement. Soon these hands would grip the shuttle again, would guide threads through the loom, would continue the work that had paused at yesterday's end. The graying beard that framed his face remained invisible in the darkness, but it was there nonetheless, each hair a testament to his 41 years, each strand marking the passage of time and the accumulation of experience. In the growing light that approached, it would catch the dawn's first rays and show its mixture of brown and silver, evidence of a life half-lived, a journey neither just beginning nor near its end. Margaret stirred more noticeably now, her body shifting beneath the blanket as sleep's hold began to loosen. Her eyelids moved slightly, though they remained closed, some dream or half-conscious thought passing through her mind like a cloud across water. The movement of her brown hair, streaked with gray, whispered against the pillow with a sound so soft it was barely perceptible. The night continued to hold them, but its grip had weakened. Dawn approached with the inevitability of the shuttle's passage through the loom, each moment bringing the sun closer to the horizon, each breath drawing them nearer to the moment when sleep would release them, and the new day would begin. Alden rested still in deep peace, his deep contentment carried even into these last moments of sleep, his 41 years having taught him to rest thoroughly so he might work completely. The darkness wrapped around him like finished cloth, warm and protective, but soon it would be time to set aside rest and return to the loom, to the threads that waited, to the work that gave his life its shape and meaning and purpose. The first bird in the rafters opened its eyes and began to sing, a tentative note that hung in the darkness like a question waiting for answer. Another bird joined the first, then another, until the dawn chorus had begun in earnest, filling the pre-dawn air with sound that penetrated even the thick walls of the sleeping chamber. The music was gentle at first, building gradually in volume and complexity as more voices added themselves to the collective song. Margaret's eyes opened, though she remained still beneath the blanket, allowing herself a moment to adjust to waking before moving. The room remained completely dark, no hint of light showing through the shutters, but her body knew the time as surely as if she could see the position of the sun. She lay quietly, listening to the birds and to Alden's continued steady breathing beside her, gathering her thoughts before the day's work would begin. She moved carefully, not wanting to wake her husband, though his deep contentment in sleep made him unlikely to stir at small movements. The blanket lifted as she sat up, and cool air rushed in to replace the warmth she had helped create through the night. The chill made her pause, but only briefly, before she swung her legs over the side of the bed and felt for her shoes with her feet. The wooden floor was cold against her soles as she stood, and she moved quickly to pull on the woolen stockings and leather shoes she had left ready the night before. Her work-worn hands found them easily in the darkness, every object in the room occupying a place she knew by touch alone. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the morning cold and made her way carefully toward the main room. Behind her, Alden continued to sleep, though his rest had grown lighter. His breathing had deepened slightly, and his calloused fingers had begun to move more noticeably, small twitches and curls that spoke of consciousness approaching. But full waking had not yet claimed him, and he remained in that peaceful space between sleep and awareness, his 41 years allowing him a few more moments of rest before the day would call him to his loom. Margaret moved through the darkness of the main room with the confidence of long familiarity, her feet finding the path to the hearth without need for sight. She knelt before the cold stones and began the process of uncovering the embers she had buried the night before, pushing aside ash carefully to reveal the faint glow beneath. The coals were barely alive, but alive nonetheless, and she added small pieces of kindling with gentle precision. She blew softly on the embers, her breath coaxing them back to life. A tiny flame appeared, flickering uncertainly, then caught on the dry wood and began to grow. She added more kindling, piece by piece, building the fire gradually until she could add larger wood without smothering the growing flames. The light from the fire pushed back the darkness, creating a circle of warmth and illumination in the room. The growing firelight revealed the familiar space, the table where they had eaten the night before, the shelves holding supplies and tools, the stairs leading down to the workshop. Everything stood exactly where it had been when darkness fell, unchanged and unchanging, waiting patiently for the household to wake and bring it back to purposeful use. In the sleeping chamber, Alden's eyes opened. He lay still for a moment, oriented himself to the new day, then sat up slowly. The blanket fell away from his shoulders, and he felt the cold air immediately. But he had woken into such mornings countless times and accepted the temperature as simply another aspect of the day beginning. His work-reddened hands reached for his tunic, and he dressed efficiently in the darkness. He could see the faint glow of firelight coming from the main room, and he heard Margaret moving about, the familiar sounds of her morning preparations. The day had begun, as days always began, with small actions that would accumulate into hours of productive labor. He stood and made his way from the sleeping chamber, his body still carrying some of the night's rest, but already beginning to wake fully to the requirements of consciousness. Margaret looked up as he entered the main room, and they exchanged a brief nod of greeting, no words needed in the comfortable understanding of long partnership. The fire had grown strong now, and she had hung the iron pot over it, preparing to make porridge for their morning meal. Alden moved to the basin and splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it bringing him more fully awake. Outside, the darkness had begun to thin perceptibly. The eastern horizon showed a band of lighter sky, deep blue rather than black, with the faintest suggestion of color beginning to appear at its lowest edge. The stars had faded considerably now, only the brightest still visible, and the world seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of the sun's appearance. Alden descended the stairs to his workshop, his footsteps sure on the worn stone steps even in the dimness. The room below was still quite dark, and he opened the shutters to admit what little light the pre-dawn sky provided. The cool air flowed in, fresh and clean, carrying scents of the waking town, wood smoke from fires being kindled, the earthy smell of the street, a hint of moisture in the air. He moved to his loom and stood before it for a moment, his observant eye taking in the cloth he had created the day before. The stripes of brown and cream showed clearly even in the dim light, the pattern regular and pleasing. His calloused fingers traced one of the selvages, checking its straightness, ensuring no problems had developed overnight. Everything was as it should be, ready for the day's work to continue. But first, the morning meal. He climbed back up the stairs to where Margaret had prepared bowls of porridge, simple fare that would provide energy for the hours ahead. They sat together at the table as they had sat countless mornings before, eating in companionable quiet while the fire crackled, and the world outside continued its slow emergence from darkness. The porridge was thick and warming, made from oats cooked with water and a pinch of salt. Margaret had added a small amount of honey from their stores, just enough to give it slight sweetness without being extravagant. Alden ate slowly, appreciating the simple sustenance, feeling his body fully wake as the warm food filled his stomach. Through the window, the sky continued to lighten. The deep blue had given way to paler shades, and now streaks of pink and gold had begun to appear along the eastern horizon. The sun had not yet shown itself, but its approach was evident in the steadily growing light that revealed the world in increasing detail. Church bells began to ring across the town, calling the faithful to lauds, the first service of the day. The sound rolled through the streets and reached Alden's ears as he finished his meal. He had heard these bells every morning of his life, their tones as familiar as his own heartbeat, marking time and structure and the continuing rhythm of days. Margaret cleared the bowls away, and Alden returned to the workshop, ready now to begin the day's work in earnest. He settled onto his bench before the loom, his body finding its accustomed position automatically. His work-reddened hands reached for the shuttle, and it fit into his palm with the perfect familiarity of a tool shaped to its user. The light from the window had grown sufficient for weaving now, and Alden could see the threads clearly before him. He pressed the foot treadle, changing the shed, and passed the shuttle through in one smooth motion. The beater came forward with its satisfying thump, and the first thread of the new day was added to the cloth. His humming began naturally, the plain chant melody rising softly in the workshop as his hands found their rhythm. The shuttle passed back and forth, the beater pressed each thread into place, and the ancient pattern of weaving continued as it had for countless generations before him. Outside, the sun finally crested the horizon, sending its first rays across the rooftops and through Alden's window, gilding everything it touched with morning light. The day had begun, and with it, the gentle continuation of work that gave life meaning and purpose. Alden, 41 years old, settled deeper into his rhythm, his deep contentment filling him as completely as the growing light filled his workshop. The shuttle passed through the threads, the cloth grew beneath his patient care, and the morning unfolded with the same peaceful inevitability that had brought him through the darkness and back to this moment of quiet purpose. The sunlight streaming through the workshop window grew warmer and more golden as the morning progressed. Alden continued his work with the same steady rhythm that had carried him through decades at this loom, the shuttle passing through the warp threads with hypnotic regularity. Each movement added another line to the growing cloth, building on the pattern he had established the day before. His calloused fingers moved with the certainty of long practice, adjusting tension here, correcting a slight irregularity there, maintaining the quality that had earned him respect among the town's craftsmen. The brown stripe he was weaving had nearly reached its intended width, and soon he would switch back to cream, continuing the alternating pattern that would make this cloth both attractive and serviceable. The scent of wool filled his awareness, mixed with the morning smells drifting through the open window, bread baking in nearby ovens, wood smoke rising from chimneys, the fresh air that promised a fair day ahead. These familiar aromas wrapped around him like a comfortable garment, anchoring him in the present moment while his hands continued their ancient work. Osric arrived as the sun climbed higher, greeting his master respectfully before moving to his own smaller loom. The boy had grown noticeably in skill over recent weeks, and Alden had observed this progress with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher seeing knowledge take root. The workshop filled with the sound of two looms working in harmony, their different rhythms creating a gentle counterpoint that spoke of craft and continuity. By mid-morning, Alden paused to examine his work. The cloth had grown considerably since he had begun at dawn, several new stripes adding to the overall length. He stood and stretched, feeling the pleasant tiredness in his shoulders and back that came from purposeful labor. His work-reddened hands flexed and relaxed, ready to continue but appreciating the brief rest. He walked to the window and looked out at the street beyond. Other craftsmen were visible at their work, the potter at his wheel, the carpenter planing wood, the cordwainer cutting leather. Each pursued their trade with the same dedication Alden brought to weaving, each contributing their skill to the town's prosperity and the comfort of its inhabitants. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, and Alden felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun streaming through the window. Their years together had woven a partnership as strong and reliable as any cloth he had ever created. She smiled slightly, that small expression conveying understanding and shared contentment, then disappeared back to her own work. Alden returned to his bench and settled once more into position. His 41 years had taught him that life's deepest satisfaction came not from grand achievements, but from the steady accumulation of days well spent, from work done with care and attention, from the knowledge that his hands created something useful and lasting. The shuttle resumed its passage through the threads. The beater pressed each new line into place with its familiar sound. His humming rose softly in the workshop, the plain chant melody weaving itself through the morning air like an invisible thread, connecting this moment to all the moments that had come before and all those yet to come. Outside, the town continued its daily rhythm, voices calling, footsteps passing, the bells marking the canonical hours. Inside the workshop, Alden worked on in peaceful concentration, his deep contentment suffusing every movement. The cloth grew steadily beneath his patient care, stripe by stripe, thread by thread, each pass of the shuttle another small contribution to the ongoing pattern of his life's work. The morning light shifted across the floor as the sun continued its climb, and Alden moved with it through the hours, his hands never faltering, his attention never wavering. This was his calling, his craft, his purpose, the transformation of simple wool into fabric that would warm and protect, created with skill passed down through generations and care accumulated through decades of practice. The loom stood solid beneath his hands, the thread stretched taut and waiting, and the shuttle traced its endless path through the shed. Time flowed like water, smooth and continuous, carrying him gently through the day. His work-reddened hands shaped thread into cloth, his patient attention guided each movement, and his 41 years of experience infused every action with quiet mastery. The brown stripe completed, he switched to cream, the transition creating another clean line in the growing pattern. The cloth wrapped on the beam behind him held the record of his labor, hours and days transformed into tangible form, proof of time well spent and skill well applied. And still the work continued, as it would continue tomorrow and the day after, the endless rhythm of craft that gave shape and meaning to his days. Alden's graying beard caught the sunlight as he bent over his work, and his calloused fingers guided the shuttle with gentle precision. The workshop wrapped around him with its familiar comfort, the scent of wool, the sound of the looms, the warmth of morning light. This was his world, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything he needed. The shuttle passed through the shed once more, the beater came forward, and another thread joined the cloth. The pattern grew, the day progressed, and Alden worked on in perfect peace, his life woven as surely and completely as any fabric on his loom, each thread in its proper place, each color where it belonged, each day adding to the larger pattern of a life lived with purpose, skill, and deep, abiding contentment.